Hey everyone, and welcome to our deep dive. Today we're tackling a topic that's pretty much a daily ritual for most folks. Eating breakfast. Is it really the most important meal like we've always been told? Or is that whole idea, kind of big scam? We're going to dig into the whole history of breakfast, look at all the marketing behind it, and even chat about some of the big names involved, like Dr. John Harvey Kellogg and C.W. Post.
Yeah, it's interesting how breakfast as this structured meal with certain foods is a pretty recent thing.
Right, I was reading about that. It seems like before the Industrial Revolution, people just ate whenever they felt like it in the morning.
Exactly.
There wasn't a set breakfast time or anything, or even like special breakfast foods.
It was really the Industrial Revolution that made breakfast a routine.
Ah, makes sense.
Factories needed workers to be ready to go at the start of their shift.
Yeah, long shifts.
Exactly, and a big breakfast seemed like the way to do it.
So basically, breakfast became a thing because of factory workers.
Yeah.
I never thought about it that way.
It's a good example of how what we see as normal eating habits are often tied to economics.
Yeah, wow. Makes you think.
It really does. And when we're talking about big names in breakfast, we got to mention Dr. John Harvey Kellogg.
Oh yeah, Dr. Kellogg. He was more than just a cereal guy, right? I mean, he was all about health reform, but with some interesting ideas.
He had some unusual beliefs, that's for sure.
Like what?
Well, Kellogg was a big believer in bland breakfast.
Bland breakfast.
Yeah. He thought they could suppress urges.
Urges.
Like especially,
okay.
sexual urges.
Yay. So he thought eating boring food would keep people from getting,
Yeah. Kind of wild, right?
It does sound a little out there now.
It does, but it was a different time back then.
I guess so.
Different social norms.
Yeah, totally different.
Kellogg's views were very much shaped by his era.
Right, right. So we've got the Industrial Revolution kickstarting breakfast as a routine, and then Dr. Kellogg with his bland food theories.
Exactly.
What comes next in this breakfast story?
Well, that's when C.W. Post enters the picture.
Oh, right, C.W. Post.
Another big name in cereal.
He was a rival of Kellogg's, wasn't he?
He was. And he had a very different approach.
Like how?
He was all about marketing and, well, making some pretty big health claims.
He was the grape nuts guy, right?
Hmm.
I read that he marketed it as some kind of miracle food.
Miracle food, that's right.
Did any of it actually hold up, though?
Not really. Post was a master of hype,
Like what kind of claims?
He claimed grape nuts could cure, everything.
Everything.
Indigestion, appendicitis, you name it.
Wow.
It was a big shift from focusing on actual health to focusing on making money.
Profit over health, huh?
Basically. And that kind of paved the way for how the breakfast industry works today.
So it all became about selling, not about what's good for you. That's a big change.
Yeah, a huge change.
Feels like that's where our modern breakfast culture really started.
Absolutely.
Post's marketing tactics, the stage. And while we're on the topic of marketing, we can't forget that famous phrase, breakfast is the most important meal of the day.
Oh, yeah, everyone's heard that one a million times.
Right. It sounds so official, like something a doctor would say.
Like a medical fact.
But the real story behind it's pretty wild, isn't it?
It is.
So where'd that phrase actually come from?
Well, our research shows that it wasn't doctors or nutritionists who came up with it. It was actually cereal companies back in the 1940s.
Really?
Yep.
So the most famous saying about breakfast is basically just a marketing slogan. Wow.
I guess it worked, though.
Yeah, it totally stuck with us.
It's the perfect example of how a slogan can change how people think.
Yeah, it's crazy how effective it was.
That phrase basically made everyone believe skipping breakfast was bad.
Even without any real proof.
Exactly.
It makes you wonder how many other so-called truths about food are just, clever marketing.
Right.
And it wasn't just cereal companies pushing breakfast, right? Didn't the government get involved at some point?
They did.
When was that?
During World War II, the government started promoting breakfast as a patriotic duty.
Wow, a patriotic duty.
Yep, it was a way to support the economy.
Yeah.
And encourage people to buy all those grains and eggs.
So breakfast was tied to, national well-being.
It was. There was a lot of pressure to eat breakfast.
And then wasn't there some research in the 1950s that said skipping breakfast was bad for you?
There was.
What was that all about?
A scientist named Ansel Keys did some research that linked skipping breakfast to weight gain.
Oh, right, Ansel Keys.
It made the whole breakfast is essential idea even stronger.
But there's a twist, isn't there?
There is. It's
Yeah.
all about who funded that research.
Yeah, it was breakfast food companies, wasn't it?
You got it.
Figures.
It does make you wonder about bias.
Right. if the people paying for the research are the ones who benefit from those results.
Hmm.
Interesting.
And to be fair, the research didn't actually prove that breakfast itself caused weight gain.
Oh, really?
It could be that people who skipped breakfast just made different choices later in the day.
Like what?
Maybe they ate more later, or maybe they ate less healthy things.
So it's not as simple as eat breakfast, lose weight.
Not at all. It's about what you eat overall, not just at breakfast.
Makes sense. This whole breakfast thing is way more complicated than I ever realized.
It really is. And then you've got the rise of intermittent fasting.
Oh, yeah. Everyone's talking about intermittent fasting these days.
It's gotten super popular.
Yeah.
And it often involves, well,
Skipping breakfast.
exactly.
So intentionally not eating breakfast, something we've been told is bad for decades, might actually be good for you.
That's what some research suggests.
That's a pretty big shift.
Yeah, it really challenges the breakfast is king idea.
It does. So what's the evidence for the benefits of intermittent fasting?
Well, there's growing evidence that it can improve things like insulin sensitivity,
Okay.
reduce inflammation, and even potentially benefit brain health.
Wow, that's interesting.
It suggests our bodies might actually do better with a break from digesting food all the time.
That's fascinating. So maybe we don't need to fuel up first thing in the morning, like we've always thought.
Maybe not.
This is really making me rethink everything I thought I knew about breakfast. It's kind of mind-blowing.
But keep in mind, the research on intermittent fasting is still ongoing.
Right. It's not a one-size-fits-all thing.
Definitely not.
And it's always best to talk to a doctor before making big changes to your diet.
Absolutely. It's important to get personalized advice.
Totally agree.
But it's still pretty fascinating that skipping breakfast, something that's been demonized for so long, could actually have health benefits.
Yeah, it really makes you think.
It does make you wonder if other things we believe about breakfast might be wrong too.
Yeah, it's like everything we've been told is being turned upside down.
Yeah.
And speaking of things that might be wrong, let's go back to that research from the 1950s about skipping breakfast and weight gain.
The Ansel Keys research.
Yeah, we talked about how it was funded by breakfast food companies, which raises some red flags. But were there any other criticisms of that research?
Yeah, there were actually a few.
Like what?
One big problem was that the studies didn't look at what people ate later in the day.
I see.
It's possible that those who skipped breakfast just made up for it by eating more at other meals, or maybe they ate less healthy foods throughout the day.
So maybe it wasn't the breakfast itself that was causing weight gain.
Right. It was more about their overall eating habits.
That makes more sense. It's not just about one meal, it's about the whole picture.
Exactly. And another problem with those studies was that they only looked at short-term effects.
Short-term effects.
They didn't track people over a long period of time.
I see.
So we don't really know what the long-term impact of skipping breakfast might be, whether it affects weight management in the long run
Right, right.
or overall health.
So there's still a lot we don't know about how breakfast really affects us.
There is. A lot more research is needed.
Yeah, it's kind of unsettling to realize that something we've all believed for so long might not be true after all.
It's one of those things we take for granted, right?
Exactly. Like breakfast is good for you, period.
But it might not be that straightforward.
It's not as clear-cut as we thought.
Science is all about constantly questioning and exploring, and revising our understanding as we learn more.
It's a process. We can't just stick to the same old ideas.
We have to be open to new evidence.
Right. So we need to ditch the dogma and embrace the nuance.
I like that. Ditch the dogma, embrace the nuance.
But before we get too philosophical here, I'm curious about breakfast around the world.
Oh, that's interesting. Breakfast traditions.
Yeah, does every culture emphasize a big morning meal like we do?
Not at all. Breakfast looks very different around the world.
Really? How so?
In some cultures, breakfast is very light and simple, while in others, it's a huge feast.
Wow. I'd love to learn more about those cultural differences. It might help us challenge our own ideas about what breakfast should be.
It's always good to broaden our perspective.
Yeah, totally. To see how other people do things.
Looking at different cultures can help us appreciate the many ways people approach breakfast.
So where should we start our global breakfast tour? Any cultures that have particularly interesting breakfast habits?
Well, Japan is a good example. They
Japan.
have a long tradition of eating savory breakfasts.
Savory breakfast.
Yeah. Things like rice, fish, miso soup, and pickled vegetables.
Wow, that sounds amazing.
Very different from the sugary cereals and pastries that are common in the West.
It does.
Yeah.
And probably way healthier too.
It's definitely a reminder that there's no single right way to eat breakfast.
Right.
What's considered healthy and normal varies from culture to culture, and from person to person.
Yeah, it depends on what you're used to, what you like.
Exactly. And what your body needs.
It's liberating to think about breakfast as a blank slate, you know,
It is.
not just a set of rules. We can experiment with different flavors, ingredients, timings.
We can find what works best for us individually.
Exactly.
It's about reclaiming breakfast as a personal choice.
Not an obligation. Not something we have to do a certain way.
It's about what feels right for you.
I love that.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation.
Yeah, it really has.
We've deconstructed this whole breakfast myth. We've looked at the marketing and economics behind it. We've even explored intermittent fasting and global breakfast traditions.
It's a lot to take in.
It is, but there's one more piece of the puzzle we need to address.
Oh, what's that?
The psychology of breakfast.
The psychology.
The role of habit, routine, emotional comfort.
You're right. Even if we understand all the marketing hype and the questionable science, there's something about a familiar breakfast routine that just feels good,
I get it. It's comforting. It brings a sense of stability.
especially in our crazy busy lives.
It's like a little anchor, a familiar starting point for the day.
Exactly.
And we touched on this earlier. Those positive associations with breakfast can be really powerful.
They can. The taste, the warmth, the feeling of taking care of yourself.
It all adds up. Those feelings can become so ingrained in our minds.
Yeah, they can override any logical reasons to change our habits.
Right.
So even if we know skipping breakfast might not be a big deal, our emotional brain is still clinging to that bowl of cereal.
It's a tough habit to break, even when we know better.
So how do we bridge that gap? How do we balance our rational minds and our emotional attachments to breakfast?
Well, it's not about ignoring those emotions or denying ourselves the pleasure of a comforting breakfast.
So what's the approach?
It's about being curious and kind to ourselves, about exploring our relationship with breakfast with a sense of self-compassion. Instead of beating ourselves up for not eating breakfast, we can ask ourselves, what do I really need this morning?
I like that. It's so easy to just go through the motions.
It is.
But if we slow down and actually pay attention, maybe we'll realize our bodies are telling us something different.
Maybe they are. It's about listening to those cues.
And being open to trying new things.
Oh,
Right?
exactly.
Like maybe delay breakfast by an hour or two. Or try a lighter option.
Just experiment a little, see how your body responds.
Yeah, that makes sense.
The key is to give ourselves permission to break the rules, to let go of those rigid ideas about what breakfast should be.
Right. If a later brunch feels better for you, then go for it.
Exactly.
And if a traditional breakfast is what makes you feel your best, then stick with it.
It's all about making a conscious choice.
Not just doing what we've always done or what we think we should do.
It's about reclaiming breakfast.
Making it an enjoyable experience that works for you. I love that.
It's about tuning into your individual needs and desires.
And letting go of the one-size-fits-all approach.
Yeah, embrace the diversity of breakfast preferences and practices.
This conversation has been so helpful.
I'm glad.
We've really unpacked the whole breakfast thing.
From history to marketing to psychology.
But as we wrap up this part of our deep dive,
Right.
what's the main takeaway for our listeners?
I would say, question everything you've been told about breakfast.
Yeah.
Don't just accept those marketing messages or supposed truths. Be curious. Explore different perspectives. And most importantly, listen to your own body and intuition.
That's such great advice. And I'd add, don't be afraid to break the rules. If skipping breakfast feels good and works for you, go for it.
Absolutely. And if you love a big weekend brunch, enjoy every bite.
Breakfast is yours to define.
You get to decide what it means for you.
I love that. We'll be back after a short break to explore this idea of reclaiming breakfast even further. How do we break free from those ingrained habits and really tap into what our bodies need? We'll dive into all that and more in the final part of our deep dive. Welcome back. We've been talking about all the forces that shaped breakfast, the history, the marketing. It's a lot to think about.
It really is.
It makes you wonder if there are other morning routines we do because of clever marketing.
Yeah.
You know, things we think are essential but actually aren't.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, what about coffee culture? We pay a fortune for fancy coffee drinks when a regular cup at home would give us the same caffeine.
Right.
Like, has our love for coffee become more about showing off with a fancy latte?
That's a good point.
And don't even get me started on all those breakfast gadgets. The toasters, the waffle makers. Do we really need all that stuff?
It's easy to get caught up in the hype.
It is.
But let's get back to intermittent fasting.
Okay, we talked about it briefly before. It really challenges that whole breakfast is king idea.
It does.
So what's the evidence for the benefits of intermittent fasting.
Well, there's more and more research showing potential benefits.
Like what?
Things like improved insulin sensitivity, reduced inflammation.
Okay. And even some potential brain health benefits.
Exactly.
So you're saying that intentionally skipping breakfast, something that's been, like, demonized for years, might actually be good for you.
The research is pointing in that direction.
That goes against everything we've been told.
It does challenge the conventional wisdom.
But, is intermittent fasting right for everyone?
Well, like with any dietary change, it's important to talk to your doctor first.
Right, of course. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution.
Definitely not.
But it's still interesting that something that goes against all the breakfast propaganda might actually be beneficial.
It is a shift in thinking.
It makes you wonder if other things we believe about breakfast are also based on, not the best evidence.
It's possible.
And speaking of shaky evidence, let's go back to that 1950s research that linked skipping breakfast to weight gain.
Right, the Ansel Keys research.
We talked about the funding from breakfast food companies. But were there any other problems with that research?
Yeah, there were a few other criticisms.
Like what?
Well, one major flaw was that those studies didn't consider what people ate later in the day.
I see.
So it's possible those who skipped breakfast just compensated by eating more later on. Or maybe they chose less healthy options throughout the day.
So it wasn't necessarily the breakfast itself causing weight gain.
Right.
It was their overall dietary pattern.
Exactly.
Makes sense.
Another criticism is that those studies only looked at short-term effects.
Short-term.
They didn't track people over a long period.
So we don't really know the long-term impact of skipping breakfast,
We don't.
whether it affects weight in the long run or has other health consequences.
Exactly.
It's kind of unsettling, isn't it? To realize something we've taken for granted for so long might not be true.
It is, but that's the nature of science. We're constantly learning and updating our understanding.
Right, it's an ongoing process.
We have to be open to new information and be willing to change our minds.
Ditch the dogma. Embrace the nuance.
Yeah.
But before we get too philosophical, I'm curious about breakfast in other cultures.
Oh, that's a fascinating topic.
Does every culture have this big emphasis on breakfast like we do?
Not at all. Breakfast traditions vary widely around the world.
Oh, really? How so?
Well, in some cultures, breakfast is a very light and simple affair, while in others, it's a much more elaborate meal.
Wow, that's interesting.
It's a good reminder that there's no one right way to eat breakfast.
Right.
What's considered healthy and appropriate depends on cultural norms and individual needs.
It's kind of liberating to think about it that way,
Yeah,
Like, breakfast doesn't have to be this rigid set of rules.
it doesn't.
We can experiment and find what works best for us. It's about making breakfast a personal choice, not a dictated obligation.
Well said.
This whole conversation has been so eye-opening.
It's been a fascinating discussion.
We've really deconstructed this whole breakfast myth, haven't we?
We have, from the history to the marketing to the psychology.
And as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, what's the key takeaway for our listeners?
I'd say the most important thing is to question everything.
Question everything.
Don't blindly accept marketing messages or supposed truths about breakfast. Be curious, explore different perspectives, and most importantly, listen to your own body.
Such great advice. I'd also add, don't be afraid to break the rules. If skipping breakfast works for you, go for it.
Exactly.
If you love a big weekend brunch, enjoy it.
It's your choice.
Breakfast is what you make it.
You define it.
I love that.
It's about reclaiming breakfast from the clutches of marketing hype and societal pressures, and making it a truly personal and enjoyable experience.
Well said.
It's been a pleasure exploring this topic with you.
Likewise.
Hopefully our listeners are feeling empowered to rethink their own breakfast habits.
And we'll be back after a short break to talk about how to reclaim breakfast, how to break free from those ingrained habits and find what truly nourishes us. Stay tuned for the final part of our deep dive. And we're back for the final part of our breakfast deep dive. We've gone through the history, the marketing, and even looked at how other cultures approach breakfast. But now, let's get a little more personal. How can we actually use what we've learned to change our own breakfast habits?
It's all about taking that knowledge and making it work for you.
Right. And before the break, we were talking about how, emotionally attached we can be to our breakfast routines.
Those rituals can be really powerful.
Yeah, even if we know they're not the healthiest or most logical, it's hard to break those habits.
It makes sense, though. Breakfast is often the first thing we do each day.
Yeah, it sets the tone for the whole day. So it makes sense that those rituals can make us feel more in control, especially when life feels chaotic.
It's like a little anchor point in the midst of all the craziness.
Exactly. And we talked about how strong those positive associations can be.
The case, the warmth, the feeling of being taken care of.
Yeah, it all adds up.
It really does. And those feelings can be so strong that they kind of override any logical arguments against those breakfast habits.
So even if we get that skipping breakfast might not be bad, our emotional brain is still holding on tight to that bowl of cereal.
Exactly.
So how do we deal with that?
Well, it's not about trying to, suppress those emotions or denying ourselves the enjoyment of a good breakfast.
So what's the solution?
It's about approaching this whole thing with curiosity.
Curiosity.
Yeah, and self-compassion.
Self-compassion.
Basically, instead of feeling bad about not eating breakfast or feeling like we're failing, we can start asking ourselves, what do I actually need this morning?
I like that. It's so easy to just go on autopilot.
It is. But if we actually tune in and pay attention...
Yeah. We might realize our bodies are telling us something different.
And that's where the curiosity comes in. Be open to experimenting a bit.
Like how?
Maybe try pushing back breakfast an hour or two.
Okay.
See how you feel.
Or if you usually have a big breakfast, try something lighter.
I think the most important thing is giving ourselves permission to break those breakfast rules.
I agree.
If a later brunch works better for you, then do that.
Exactly. It's about what feels right for your body.
And if you feel great with the traditional breakfast, then keep doing that.
The point is to make it a conscious choice, not something you do just out of habit or obligation.
So it's about reclaiming breakfast.
Yeah. Making it an enjoyable experience that fits your needs.
Exactly.
It's about listening to your body, figuring out what truly nourishes you.
And not blindly following external rules.
Right.
It's about finding what works for you as an individual and remembering that our needs can change over time.
Absolutely. What worked in the past might not be the best approach now. So it's all about paying attention and adjusting as we go.
Exactly. It's an ongoing process of self-discovery.
I love that.
It's about recognizing that there's no one right way to do breakfast. And that's really freeing, isn't it?
It is.
It takes the pressure off.
Yeah.
And allows us to find joy in the ritual, whatever form it takes.
And as we wrap up this whole breakfast deep dive, what's the final message for our listeners?
I think the most important thing to remember is that knowledge is power. Now that you know more about the history, the marketing, the psychology of breakfast, you can approach your morning routine with more intention. You have the power to make informed choices.
I love that. And I'd add, don't be afraid to challenge the status quo.
Yes.
Question everything you've been told. Experiment with different approaches and create a breakfast ritual that truly nourishes you.
Well said. It's been great exploring this topic with you.
Likewise. I hope our listeners are feeling inspired to rethink their own breakfast habits. And that's it for our deep dive into the world of breakfast. Thanks for joining us, and we'll be back soon with another deep dive into a topic that will make you think differently about the world around you.